Welcome back for the week 5 walkthrough of our sourdough. So let's go ahead and take a peek at our sourdough. My lid's getting a little sticky. And you can see I named my sourdough starter this time. It just kind of makes things a little more fun, especially if you have kids working with you. It makes it a little more fun. And for this one, I have several other starters, so I want to have this one personally have a name so that I can keep it separated. And I really have enjoyed this starter because of its unique aroma that it has. It's got so much of a kind of like, of course it's got the alcohol component to it, but it also has like a really unique sort of kind of fruity flavor to it that's almost like reminiscent of champagne. So I named it Champ because I'm not very original. Okay, so you can see here is our close-up for the week. You can see we have all sorts of bubbles and activity. I just took this out of the fridge yesterday. I'm getting it prepared like we're going to cook with it. So I took it out of the fridge yesterday where it had been dormant since last week. And all I did to get it livened back up to be able to cook with is I didn't do a whole regular feeding. I didn't stir it 12 hours. I'm just getting lazy now. So I just did 1 tablespoon of flour, stirred it in, and then just let it sit overnight so it was able to come up to temperature, come up to room temperature because it was cold and in the fridge, and then also get things livened up and woken back up. And so right now it is ready to cook with. How you can also check if you're wondering if maybe your sourdough hasn't come back to life yet is here we just have a cup of regular water. I'm just gonna dip in with a clean spoon. I'm going to dip in and just take a little bit of our starter, and I'm going to put our starter in to this water. Okay. And the part about that is significant, I forgot to give myself something to put the spoon down on, so I guess I'll just rest it in here. But you can see, let me bring it up here. Of course, some of the starter's breaking down in the water, but can you see the main part of the starter here is floating on the surface of the water because it is so full of air that it floats. That is a sign that it is healthy and active. If you spoon yours into a glass of water and it sinks to the bottom, that's a sign that it's not fully activated and it's not fully woken up. And so you may need to feed it more, or something could have gone wrong with it. But that floating starter is exactly what you are looking for. So this is going to be a good, healthy starter for us to be able to use in our recipes. Especially if you have a starter that is this vigorous and this active. You can see lots and lots of big bubbles, small fine bubbles, just a whole mix. And you also have it rising beyond where it was when you first stirred it up. It's very obviously active. You may not need to do anything extra. You should just be able to follow the recipes. But with sourdough recipes, especially the recipes for the sourdough bread and the sourdough pizza crust, they are going to require a heated rise. You are going to need to have good, very warm temperatures to incubate them to get them to rise with just the sourdough starter on its own. So if it's a really warm day, especially in the summer, I'll just put it out in the garage. If the garage is, 80, 90 degrees, it'll rise in no time flat. But it's looking, I think the weather, depending on your weather, if the weather is a little bit more chilly and your house is in the 60s or low 70s, it's going to be really hard for this sourdough to rise without some help. So some help could be something like if you have one of those like body warmer, like plug-in back warming pads, you could take your mixing bowl once you've made your recipe and put the bowl directly on that pad and wrap it in blankets. and that might help give that enough heat. Or you could put it in your oven with the light on and just be super careful to make sure nobody in your house turns the oven on while your sourdough recipe is incubating in your oven. If you've got somewhere in your house that's really, really warm, that can also work. If you've got an empty milk jug and a big cooler, you can take that empty milk jug and fill it up with really hot tap water and put it in one side of the cooler and put your mixing bowl that has your sourdough recipe that needs to incubate in it in the other side of the cooler and close the cooler. And that heat from that big bottle of water will incubate your sourdough. And if you don't have, if you can't figure out any of those options, the one other option that it's kind of cheating, but the other option that you could do is, along with your regular recipe that calls for sourdough, you've got some of that leftover yeast from the packet that we didn't fully use. If you kept a hold of that, you can add a teaspoon of yeast along with everything else the recipe calls for, and that will make sure there's enough of that yeast that's not so concentrated on being like the old school flavorful yeast. It's kind of the new school not so flavorful yeast that comes in the packet. We've been maturing this to get that old school flavorful yeast going, but if we add to that team a good amount of the new school quick yeast from our active dry yeast that we have left over, it's going to speed up our rise times. So instead of having to wait for a sourdough bread loaf to rise for, 6 or 7 hours in a cold house, on the counter, maybe it only takes an hour and a half if you've added that little bit of extra yeast. Again, my recommendation would be use the incubation method to heat up and get your actual wild mature yeast to do your rising for you. But if you absolutely don't have access to, a cooler and an empty jug of water, or an oven that you can leave the light on and have it be warm in there, or a heater, like a heated blanket or a heated kind of back pad or anything like that, you don't have any of those, go ahead and add that extra little teaspoon of yeast to your recipe, and that'll kind of save your bacon from the problems that low rising temperatures are going to give you. So with that, the other thing that I wanted to touch on is how to take care of this moving forward. For these recipes, you're going to be using a whole cup of starters. So you're actually going to be taking this down to a quarter. It's up to you how you want to refill this. You can continue to do the feedings like we had done. So, 2 tablespoons of flour, 1 tablespoon of water, that way. But if you want to cook a little bit faster, you don't want to have to wait so much, and you don't want to have to do as much daily care, you can go ahead and literally just feed it back, so if it's down to 1 cup and you want it to back up to 2 cups, feed it a cup of flour and a half a cup of water and mix it up. You can just feed it lump sums. It might take a good 24 or more hours to digest that, so it's going to take a little longer to digest those big meals than it would our little small feedings that we had been doing. But that's fine. Also, if you want to put your sourdough starter in the fridge because you don't want to take care of it daily, it can sit in the fridge for 2 or more. It can sit in the fridge for a very long time. It can sit in the fridge for months. I would suggest bringing it out maybe every 2 weeks to a month and feeding it and getting it active again, because the longer you leave it in the fridge, the more kind of revive time it's going to take to get it good and active like this again. So if it's only been in there a couple days, it'll get reactivated overnight. If it's been in there a month, it might take a couple days to get it kind of warmed back up and into the kind of rigmarole of things. I've had a sourdough starter that I just for the fun of it, I left in there for a year and never touched. And I was able to revive it, but it took a solid 4 or 5 days to get it revived. It was really, really dormant. Also, if you don't want to have to keep it in your fridge, but you still feel a little bit of attachment to it, you can take and put a big sheet of parchment paper or a big sheet of wax paper out and pour some of the live, fresh active starter on that and spread it out real thin with a silicone scraper or spatula or even just a butter knife. Spread it real thin. And then you're going to need to put it into either a dehydrator, if you have one of those, or you can put it into a dehydrator on low heat setting. Or you can put it in your oven with the light on, or you can just put it somewhere where, animals, children, etc. are not going to bother it. And you're going to leave it to dry for a couple of days until it becomes a very matte, powdery, floury appearance. And then you break up the dried starter into little chips, and you can put them in a small glass jar or a Ziploc bag, and you can actually take that bone dry sourdough starter and throw it in the freezer. And if you ever want to restart your starter, all you have to do is take those little sourdough chips, throw them back into a jar, add water, and add a little bit of extra flour and just stir them up, and within a day or two, you'll have a live active sourdough starter again. That's the way to get it to take up the least amount of space and be out of your way, is dehydrate it down into a small amount of it down into those little crumbs and then throw it in the freezer. And from there, once you've dehydrated it and put it in the freezer, especially if you store it in a glass jar that's airtight, Ziploc bags aren't going to be airtight, but a small glass jar that's airtight like a baby food jar, it'll last literally indefinitely. So as long as that freezer works, it'll probably, I don't know that there's a limit to the time that it would last. It would last probably the rest of your life. So those are your options now that your sourdough starter is completely mature and ready to go. And our little add a teaspoon of yeast cheat if you can't find a warm place to raise your recipes in. So I think we've covered all of our bases for this week. Have a really good time cooking your stuff and enjoy.